Randy Forbes is joining us, as Republican from Virginia, also in the 4th District. He also is a member of the Armed Services Committee. Welcome.
Hey, Joe, thank you for having us.
Specifically militarily, when it comes to ship or projects, when it comes to the military, how is your state affected because of today?
Well, obviously, we're impacted more than anyone else, and our region is probably impacted more because we contribute a lot to the national defense of the country. But, Pedro, it's important that we remember it's not just a single day and it's not just sequestration. These impacts come and began several years ago, and we started having these enormous cuts to national defense. And people don't realize we've already cut out over $587 billion out of national defense. The impact of those cuts are just starting to wash up on the country now, and literally we're starting to come into play. And then when you add sequestration on top of that, which could be another $500 billion cuts, it's going to be huge economically, but also huge from the strategic security of the country.
What programs are directly affected as of today?
You have to start back, and you can't just say today because we don't know. We will mitigate a lot of these next week, Pedro, because, as Mike mentioned, it's the lack of a budget that's also part of this. We'll have a continuing resolution on the floor. The House has gone home, the Senate's gone home, but the chairman of the Armed Services Committee and the subcommittee chairman of each of those committees, we're here today. We're continuing to work today to make sure we get a resolution that's a continuing resolution with the anomalies that the military needs to mitigate most of these harsh impacts that I think will be passed by the House and the Senate in the next few weeks. But, Pedro, coming back to your question, it's not just one program. Before we even got to sequestration, with the cuts we've already taken, in 2007, the Navy was able to meet 90% of our co-commanders requirements across the globe. Last year, we only met 51%. The Air Force will testify that they've had a declining state of readiness since 2003, yet we've had, again, $587 billion of cuts to the Air Force. The Army was already getting ready to cut 80,000 people out of the military based on the cuts that are already made. So it's the compilation of this that's really going to hit the country hard.
Why not look at some of those programs to see if they're all absolutely necessary?
It's a great question, Pedro, and here's what's happening to our military now. We are literally unilaterally disarming from two pincer movements. One are these cuts, because fair question to say, do we have waste at the Pentagon and stuff? We do. The unfortunate thing, all these cuts don't get at the waste, they get at the muscle. Now, where the other part is that we also have to look at is our procurement process is also killing us, because it used to be that a short time ago we could have 2, 3, 4 people approve platforms before they got done. Pedro, literally today, and not figuratively, but literally, it takes 40 different approvals from different groups before you can have a platform out. So the military will tell you that not only extends the cost enormously, but also the time to deliver these. And sometimes we're taking 10 to 22 years. Our subcommittee is launching an effort. We're going to change this. We're going to look at the procurement process and these cuts to try to revitalize the military.
This statement from the Washington Post editorial this morning, then we'll get to calls. Congress and President Obama have chosen not to govern, and said each side has concluded that its interest lies in letting the sequester proceed as scheduled and then trying to win the political blame game.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. I've been saying all along there's way too much bravado here in Washington, too much from the White House, too much from Congress. And you have people talking at each other, not to each other. But I think you sometimes have to go back and say, when the President proposed sequestration and many members of Congress, Republican and Democratic, voted for it, and I said then, over a year ago, I said, this is where we're going to be today. For the last year, Pedro, in fact, I've spoken about it here. I've been going around the country trying to alert people to the fact that this day was coming if we didn't change this around. Pedro, it's kind of like this here in Washington. The people that supported sequestration, that suggested it, that voted for it, it's kind of like loading a gun, pointing it at your foot, and pulling the trigger, and then blaming everybody else because you shot yourself in the foot. And that's kind of what we're seeing in Washington today.
You can call our guest, tweet us as well. If you want to give us a call, the numbers will be on your screen. 585-3880 for Democrats, 585-3881 for Republicans, 585-3882 for Independents. All start with a 202 area code. We've set aside a special line for Virginia residents, 202-585-3883. First up is Middletown, New Jersey, Democrats line Bonnie for our guest, Representative Randy Forbes of Virginia.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen. Congressman Forbes, one thing that people haven't been talking much about is that the deficit has been declining over the years, and I think the problem is there's a huge difference between spending and investing. What we've been doing is a whole lot of unnecessary spending, and a large part of it is in our revenue. It exhausts our revenue. Loopholes account for $1.3 trillion of the money that we could be lowering our deficit with. And not all tax cuts should be cut, because a lot of them do help the people who need the help the most, the middle class, and all of the working class. But for Bank of America to be paying zero in taxes after we've bailed them out, and it just doesn't make any sense. For someone to take a write-off on their yacht just doesn't make any sense. Those closed would help. And this whole, we're still stuck on this idea of supply-side economics, trickle-down theory.
Okay.
It hasn't ever worked.
We'll let our guests respond.
Yeah, Bonnie, you raised a lot of good points. And one of the key things is it's great to come on the talking points and say, I'm just going to hate Bank of America, and that's the problem for all this, or I'm going to hate this person because they were successful. The reality, though, is for the last 4 years, our budget's had over $1 trillion of deficits each year. We're growing geometrically. We're going to be at a $16 trillion debt. And even the president came out and through his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said the #1 security problem to the United States of America was our debt. I think everybody recognizes we have to do something about that. The question is what? And when you look at the fact of where we are right now with the loopholes that you're talking about, it always sounds great until you do the math and put it on the paper. And the figures you give are just not accurate. To get to where you want on tax reform, notice they always say loopholes, but then they say tax reform and deductions. Some of those deductions were given so that you could do exactly what you said, so we could encourage businesses to invest in the country. We have to make a business decision. Do we want them to stop that investment? The second thing is to realize to get to the dollars that they need, there are 2 huge deductions they're going to have to take off the table or put on the table. One of them is the charitable deduction, which means that basically we're going to stop giving money to charities so we can give it to government. That doesn't make sense. The second one is the mortgage interest deduction on homes, which will be a death knell to the economy and to the home building industry. And then let me just give you this last perspective. Even with sequestration, if it takes place, the White House will have $15 billion more to spend this year than they did last year. Somebody should at least step back and say, does it really make sense, if we have even more money to spend this year than last year, that we are going to have to shut the country down because of these I believe we should have done a little bit better planning, a little bit better analysis to get our fiscal house in order.
Harrogate, Tennessee. Linda, Republican line.
Good morning.
Morning.
Morning, Linda.
Aren't there a lot of waste and fraud that could be done away with instead of trying to cut the military?
Caller, go ahead.
Yes. Representative. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're on. Go ahead.
Aren't there a lot of waste and fraud that could be took out of the budget instead of cutting the military, robotic squirrels, and 73 more fleets of, for the president to romp around in? And
Caller, thanks.
Well, Linda, sometimes it's always great, just like with the first caller hitting loopholes, great buzzword, waste and fraud, always a great one. The overall dollars don't always add up, but let me tell you what does, just the math. When the president came into office, he wanted a very, very expensive health care bill, which he got. He also wanted an incredibly expensive stimulus package. It was $825 billion, $347 billion of interest. And then he proposed the sequestration legislation. If Congress had been able to stop him on just one of those, we would not be here today. If you look at that stimulus package, $825 billion plus $347 billion, that's exactly what we're now cutting out of sequestration. And so what we have to do is get a better priority on our spending. For example, if we just cut government travel by half, we'd save $8 billion. They're the things we need to start looking at, and we need to look at them fast.
Mike Freeman off of Twitter says, Representative Forbes, I'm with you on defense jobs for now versus war spending, but they are different items, but eventually defense spending must decrease.
I think Mike would have a good point if we looked at this. As I told you at the beginning, Peg, it's not just the overall dollars, but it's how we're spending it. What we can't do is the way the cuts have been made over the last several years. And basically, we have substituted strategic analysis for budget analysis. And when you're looking at the military, there are two pincer movements that are impacting us now. One of them are these cuts that are coming, and look, they've been arbitrary for the last several years on the $587 billion. We've made those cuts into some areas that are really putting us at risk. But secondly, that procurement process is what Mike should be getting at, because if we change that procurement process, we're going to cut a lot of the defense spending out and make it much more efficient.
Bloomberg Business Week took a look at some of the defense programs that possibly could see cuts and save money, and the first of which was the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program, which has been in the news lately because of problems with one plane, but now I guess the whole fleet has been restored.
Pedro, one of the difficult things you have on that, whether it's the F-35 or the F-22, I think we made a mistake even taking the F-22 off. It used to be 20 years ago or so, we had an office in the Pentagon called the Office of Net Assessment. And what they did was longer-term planning, planning where we looked at our potential adversaries and said what programs are not just the most efficient and effective for us, but which ones make our adversaries spend money in places that we want them to spend so they can't spend it other places. In the last several years, we've gotten out of planning in Washington. Now everything's knee-jerk reactions. We're doing 6-week planning instead of 6-month planning. We need to do longer-term planning. When you look at longer-term planning, you look at projects like the F-35 and F-22, and they take on a different light. Let me just give you an example. With the F-22, one of the purposes of the F-22 was it kept countries like China having to put their defense dollars internally to defend against their command and control structures inside. Now, because we don't have the F-22 program, it frees them to put missiles along the coast and those kind of things. That's the kind of planning, at least, Pedro, we need to go back to that we haven't done.
Bullhead City, Arizona, Betty, Independent Line, for our guest. Good morning.
Hi. I just think that the sequestration is going to put our nation at risk, and I don't think it's fair. Our protection should come first before anything. The protection of this country. People died for our freedom, and that's just a shame that the president is going this route. And I'm not blaming Democrat, Republic, whatever. I just think it's sickening that they would take the risk of our nation being in jeopardy.
I couldn't agree with you more about two things. One, the blame game, you know, you just have to call the facts where they are, and you have to make your own extrapolation of who you think's at fault. But secondly, about putting the country at risk. When sequestration was proposed, I fought against it. I voted against it. And then immediately after it was passed, I set out across the country because nobody even knew the term, Pedro, if you remember, about what sequestration was going to do. We had a campaign called Defending Our Defenders. We went across the country trying to tell people from a national defense point of view right where we would be today. Unfortunately, we weren't able to stop that. But I also want to tell you this. We're not giving up just because the deadline is today. I encourage the subcommittee chairman for the Armed Services Committee to stay here today. We're rolling up our sleeves. We're going to do what we can next week, and we will have legislation that will severely mitigate some of these harsher things that sequestration is going to take place. But it was a bad idea, bad program, and a bad result, and a failure, I think, in leadership from everybody to allow that to happen.
Representative Forbes, Alfred off of Twitter says this started when Republicans decided to take the country hostage during the debt ceiling debate.
Well, you know, and that's fine. Again, good talking point. It wasn't taking them hostage at all. I think it was when you have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, again, someone who acknowledged that he was speaking for the president and at the will of the president, begin to tell the country that the #1 national security problem we had was the debt of the country. And you simply can't spend $1.4 trillion on a health care bill and about the same amount on a stimulus bill and then not expect for us to have some spending problem somewhere. And at some point in time in the country, I think people are just saying, to Washington, you've got to do what we do at home, and you've got to come back. You can't spend more money than you make. And this continuing to borrow and put it on our children and our grandchildren, I think most economists are recognizing that we can't continue to sustain this as a nation.
Jim is from Oak Hall, Virginia, Independent Line.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen.
Hi, Jim.
I'm in my 50s, and I just recently moved into the 2nd District area over by Wallops Island. I don't know what the effects of any of this is going to have on that area. But Since the 70s, we've been hearing the same old story over and over again. Energy independence, infrastructure, jobs, defense, cut and waste. None of this is being done. All we hear is you people talking at each other, not with each other, to each other, and calling each other's names and everything. And you people have to stop this nonsense. And all these things are just being used to get elected. And then when you get in office, you're always pointing the finger at somebody else. And of course, you're not to blame. And I don't know what you're actually doing, but it's an old story, and it needs to be done, and it needs to be fixed. And please do something. Get up and get it done, and get in there and work like everybody else, not the part-time jobs that, it seems to be for you people.
Well, Jim, first of all, I don't think I've called anybody names, and I certainly hope that I haven't. I haven't done that to my knowledge. The second thing is, I think it is important that we speak out. I fought very hard on national defense where I think we have weaknesses, because I'd rather point it out now than point it out when our men and women suffer huge losses because we haven't supplied the resources that we need to do to them. And the third thing, as far as us working, there aren't certain members of Congress that do that. We just all get painted with the same brush. If you look at my subcommittee, I chair the Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee on the Armed Services Committee. And you poll any of the members, I think you'll find that's the most bipartisan subcommittee in the entire Congress. I have a very good working relationship with not just my counterpart on the Democratic side, but my friend Mike McIntyre. We work very closely together. Our committee works well together. We live in a country, though, where it's easy to point fingers at each other, to yell, scream. We hear that on the media all the time. We hear all the talking points. And the best we can do, Jim, is consistently try to peel back that onion and get to the facts so that we can move the country forward. I can tell you we're launching an effort right now from our committee to revitalize the military of the United States of America. And we're going to have to ask some tough questions, but hopefully we can put answers on the table that when the American people shine the light on it, they're going to say that's the direction we need to go.
Speaker Boehner has called for no revenue increases through taxes. What does that mean moving forward as far as some type of resolve is concerned?
Yeah.
And is it the right approach?
Well, Pedro, I can't speak for the Speaker on that. I think what the Speaker is talking about is that we have to be concerned sometime that we have false trade-offs. Let me give you an example. The same debate that we're having today was taking place right here in January about raising the tax rates. For the President got what he wanted on the tax rates, but then we turned around and in just days we spent all that money in a bill that went for emergency relief, and almost half of that was in pork barrel projects and other kinds of things that had nothing to do with emergency relief.
This was Superstorm Sandy.
Yes. So I think, Pedro, what we have to do as a nation is we have to realize that we need the revenues, and I think people don't mind putting the revenues in, but they just realize that oftentimes when the revenue comes in, it doesn't go in the priority areas. It goes out in these areas that really have little return. And again, I come back to the stimulus package, which I fought against. It was $825 billion, $347 of interest. That is why we are taking this out of defense now. But, Pedro, I didn't just do that under President Obama. I did that under President Bush, too. I'm one of 16 Republicans I'm sorry, 16 members of Congress total that voted against both the President Bush's stimulus packages and President Obama's because they just didn't work.
So how does the House move forward if the Speaker maintains his position?
Yeah. I think the way the House moves forward is, again, to sit back and say, what are our priorities as a country in spending? Whatever we do on revenue, Pedro, I think the number one priority we have to have as a nation is the national defense. And I have no problem putting all this on the table and having a fair debate about what programs we should have. But here's the question we've been asking in Washington over the last several years. How much do we want to spend on defense? What can we afford to spend on defense? Nobody's been asking the corollary question, which is this. What's the risk to the United States of America if we don't spend these dollars? And so if you look at these cuts right now, we are putting huge gaps in our missile defense systems because some of these availabilities for ships were to upgrade them for the BMD so that they could supply the missile defense system we need in Spain. We aren't doing that. If you look at just 8 years from now, we will be outmanned by submarines in the Pacific, 78 to 32 by the Chinese. That's something we ought to really step back and say, do we really want to be there?
Are increases in revenue through taxes off the table for you personally?
Oh, I've never put anything off the table. I just have always said this, just bring me the analysis and make sure you show that the analysis, it's going to work and that it's accomplishing the goals we want to